But I'm looking forward to coming back in 2020 by April and May. I want to come back to this church. It might not be a Martin Luther King Sunday, but I would like to come back to this church just to continue sharing the kind of work I will be doing in the next 1.5 years. Because you are wonderful people, and the fact that you are involved in social justice thing, we should be able to be partners and sharing stories of the kind of work we are doing. So I'm so much grateful. Maybe this is my conclusion that I'm starting. I hope to see you in 2020. Thank you so much. So Richard asked me a question about the 600 persons who were killed in the Lutheran Church. But his question was, what's the religion of balance in Liberia? In Liberia, there is a common saying. It's not in the Constitution nor any written book, but there is a common saying that Liberia was founded on Christian principles. Those who don't know much about Liberia, Liberia was founded by pre-American slaves. So in the 1800s, when slavery was abolished, the American Colonization Society that was founded started repatriating people back to Africa. And James Monroe, who was the fifth president of the United States, procured a lot of money and aided the American Colonization Society, and they started taking back the slaves to Africa. That's the reason why our capital city, Monrovia, is named after James Monroe. Your fifth president is called Monroe. So Liberia's connection with America is very, very close. So he was asking about the religion. In Liberia, we have 75% of Christians, 15% is Muslim, and the 10% believe in African traditional religion, like where people believe in nature. They go to the trees to talk to their ancestors. They go to the river to talk to their ancestors. So that's the balance. And Liberia is about 75% Christianity. I just wanted to clear that up because he had asked me a question and I needed to take copies so I could answer his question. But then I wanted you guys, or every one of you people, to also benefit from his question. So I will leave it open for any question either in Liberia, in South Sudan. I'd be willing to answer. I see your first question for Nancy.
Yes, thank you. Really wonderful, inspiring words you shared with us this morning. With all the good works that you're doing, I imagine you kind of made some enemies. Weren't you targeted by certain individuals who didn't like the work that you were doing in the ways of justice?
The government doesn't like to hear the name human rights. They think that people who are involved in human rights work against them. In Liberia, the government doesn't like to hear about human rights. They feel that people who are involved in human rights work against them. This is something in Africa. Many a times, human rights officers, people who work in the area of human rights, who always talk about the government's wrongdoing, who always push the government and they want the government to do more, who expose the government wrongdoing, they are not liked by the government. Some of them disappear and never seen, and some of their families are in big problem, and some of them get asylum somewhere. This is the kind of work that people do, and I've made a lot of enemies around the world, except people didn't even like my work. At some point, somebody even took out a pistol from his side and dashed it on the table before me, and they wanted me to tell them whether soldiers never had human rights. It was somewhere we've gone where a lot of villagers were killed, and I led a team of human rights officers there, and this guy wanted to know that soldiers too have been killed. How come human rights did not go there, but they heard that civilians have been killed, now human rights are going there? And earnestly, I didn't know that soldiers were killed, but I had to start by saying, soldiers or human rights starts with soldiers, with government officials, with police. Because according to international law, governments are the custodians of human rights. This is why we elect them. We elect government so that they will bring unto us those social blessings. So I see no reason why we will elect government or we will have government into place that will not be able to protect its citizens that elected them. So that's where who ordered the people to be massacred in St. Peter's Lutheran Church simply because the guy who led the war in Liberia, the rebel leader, the father has sought refuge at that church, and they got intelligence that Elijah Taylor, who was the father to Charles Taylor, was in the Lutheran compound among the people who had gone to seek refuge. So overnight, they went there and massacred 600 persons. Throughout the night, it was only one morning when somebody had walked to the quiet compound. A baby in one of the chairs, under one of the chairs, started crying before they could rescue the baby, and then realized that the massacre had taken place overnight. And we think this is great injustice. Soldiers are meant to protect their people. If they can come and slaughter them, where will we run? Who do we run to if we fear? Because soldiers are supposed to protect their people. If the soldiers will massacre people, then we have nowhere to go. I take questions. If I ever satisfy your question.
No, thank you.
Yes, Jody.
Jerry, who do you work for? How do you earn your living?
So I work for, when I've been volunteering, I can say throughout my life. I volunteer with the Lutheran Church in Liberia Trauma Healing Program, and I was paid $75 for my voluntary thing for a number of years until I went to Costa Rica and came back where I did my master's. And when I returned, the church employed me, and I was doing like I think $200 a month, for which was so brief. I think for 2 years. But $200 of course would be nothing to survive, to pay rent, to raise a family. Then later on, I took 2 months working for the Human Rights Commission in Liberia. The Human Rights Commission came into place by an act of legislation. We had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Liberia. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission came into place after the war, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission were charged with the responsibility of investigating crimes committed from 1979, if I'm not mistaken, to 2005. Because through all this time we have had military rules, and the military committed a lot of crimes, and the war came, a lot of crimes against humanity were committed. So the Truth and Reconciliation was investigating and documenting crimes committed in Liberia during that period. And with the understanding that after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Human Rights Commission will implement the work or recommendations that will be made by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I worked for that commission for 2 months. But when I heard that South Sudan had gotten its independence from the North after 22 years of war, I thought my experience working with the Lutheran Church in Liberia as a peace builder, as a trainer for peace and reconciliation, training people in the area of human rights, encouraging people to vote, teaching people about their rights to vote, but also the power of our votes. I thought to go to South Sudan to help in the area of institutional building. And that's why I went to South Sudan, but I also volunteer in South Sudan. So when I volunteer, I was given what we call voluntary living allowance, not a salary. I was not an employee of the organization, but they gave me voluntary living allowance that I could use to pay my rent, to buy food, to put credit in my phone. So many times, because it was not a salary that I could make, so I had to spend like sometimes 6 months without my families, because I have to keep little money from that voluntary allowance for the 4, 5, 6 months in order to buy plane ticket to go back home. So when I come home for like 2 weeks, I wouldn't see my family for like over 4, 5, 6 months before I can be able to accumulate money again to fly back. So I currently don't work for anybody, but I work for the common people that I think voices need to be heard, but I think we need to help in some ways in realizing or finding the true meaning of life.